You know what time it is. Buckle up and enjoy the ride.
And we are live. Greetings to our loyal WFYL listeners around the world. Welcome back to your Philadelphia live stream, only on the Freedom Station. I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in once again, because you still have the right to hear and the right to be heard. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mike G. As always, with me are Philly Chris, Russ the producer, and Liberty Lee. And you're listening to Mike G in the morning with The Law Matters. And you can listen to our program every Friday at 7 a.m. Eastern, only on the Freedom Station, WFYL. So let's be heard. I want to remind our listeners that you can participate in the free and open exchange of thoughts and ideas throughout the entire week by visiting MikeGinthemorning.com. What's it called, Philly Chris?
MikeGinthemorning.com.
How about you, Russ?
MikeGinthemorning.com.
Liberty, are you with us?
MikeGinthemorning.com.
That is correct. You can check out all the shenanigans that Mike G and Philly Chris are up to throughout the entire week. Don't forget to like our videos and subscribe to our YouTube channel. So tell your friends, tell your family, tell your barber, tell your Uncle Jerry, tell anybody who will listen to check us out at MikeGinthemorning.com. I also want to remind our listeners about the powerhouse lineup we've got here at the Freedom Station. Kick off your mornings with Scott Adams. Bring you the Scott Adams Show weekdays from 9 a.m. until 11. We've got Dan the Man Bongino. Bring you the Dan Bongino Show weekdays from noon until 3 p.m. We've got the headliner, intellectual giant Ben Shapiro. Bring you the Ben Shapiro Show weekdays from 3 to 5 p.m. And finally, we love having him at the Freedom Station family. We've got Michael Knowles. Bring you the Michael Knowles Show weekdays from 5 to 6 p.m. So don't forget to tune in and show him some love. And with that, you know what time it is. Buckle up and enjoy the ride. Hit it, Russ.
You know what time it is. Buckle up and enjoy the ride.
I want to thank all of our loyal listeners and members of the Mike G in the Morning family for tuning in this evening for our live stream. We've got a very special guest joining us. We've got Steve McGuire. He's had a 30-plus year career in the law, serving as an attorney and a federal judge in Washington, D.C. Steve retired in 2008 as the chief judge of the Federal Trade Commission, where he received its Distinguished Service Award and was honored by President George W. Bush for his service to the nation's judiciary. Prior to the FTC, he was an administrative law judge at the Social Security Administration and the Environmental Protection Agency. He has 2 certifications, not one but 2, from Harvard University, one from the John F. Kennedy School of Government and the other from Harvard Law School. Afterwards, he became vice president for corporate compliance at the University of Louisville Hospital. He's got a tremendous amount of credentials. These days, he's been writing books. He is the most interesting man in the world. Steve, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to be on your show tonight.
You know, I want to get into the books because this is fascinating stuff. But before we do, why don't you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to become a judge? I'll be honest, sitting here talking to you in a T-shirt feels kind of funny. Used to being in a suit talking to a judge. But tell us a little bit about why did you become a judge?
I came to Washington, D.C. when I was 25 years old as a young attorney right out of law school, and I always laugh. I say I got to Washington on January 20th, 1977, which is the same day Jimmy Carter was sworn in as president. So I was an appellate attorney for 10 to 12 years, and then became a government the procurement appeals hearings officer, conducting hearings on contract disputes throughout the country. And then I became an administrative law judge with the APA for 7 years. And then in 2003, was appointed chief judge at the Federal Trade Commission.
So why did you go into appellate law right away? I know it's a lucrative field for folks who are at those top tier law schools. Is
Well,
that
I
what drove
guess
you to do it?
because that's where the opportunity was, and
Mm.
I was interested in coming to Washington. My brother was an attorney as well in Washington, and I had 2 or 3 opportunities, but the first one I was involved with was called the Board of Surface Mining Appeals for the Department of the Interior. And at that time, I had envisioned doing that for 2 or 3 years and going back to work as a corporate attorney in my home state of Kentucky. So, but the first thing I know, I'm there for 10, 12, 15 years. And like most young people in Washington, I had no intentions of leaving.
Mm. Now, your home state of Kentucky, and then you end up at Harvard.
Well,
What did the people back home think about that?
Well, I had a couple of opportunities to get some certifications at Harvard. It was a great experience, which served me well in my government career. And then for a period of time, I was a private mediator, and I'd gone to the Harvard Law School project on negotiation, which helped a great deal there. So it was a nice experience. I enjoyed it very much.
Mm. Now, was there anything that motivated you to go into law in the first place, aside from the fact that your brother was an attorney before you became an attorney?
Yes, he was 5 years older, and actually my father was an attorney as well, although he gave up practicing law per se to pursue his career in real estate. So I'm sure they had at least a subconscious influence on my decision to go into the law. But as I'm sure you well understand, I've always had a legal education is the best education you can have, because it teaches you how to think, it teaches you how to analyze, and it teaches you how to question. And that will serve you well in any endeavor.
That's true. And there's also a work ethic that you have to learn in law school, correct?
Well, that's right. These back in the days where a young associate at a big law firm is putting in 60, 70 hours a week. I don't know if they're still doing that or not, but you had a rite of passage there with the hopes of becoming a partner someday. But I was never so much attracted to going into the law firm field as I was going to government. I had great hopes that I could perform a public service.
Now, how many years were you practicing, did you say, before you became a judge?
Probably about 15.
Okay, so you had some experience under your belt, and you felt confident and comfortable. Although I don't know how anybody ultimately ends up in a position where you feel totally comfortable.
I always said that, and what I kept in mind on the bench was that I held the public trust. And so I told myself that I wasn't going to let politics or any undue influences impact how I did my job. And I was very proud of the fact that I decided cases based on the ultimate facts that were established during the hearings and the law. And I didn't allow any outside influences to influence me regarding my ultimate holding. So that's just how I saw the job. And I always felt if we can't trust our judges to do the right thing, then our society is in great trouble. So I took that responsibility very seriously.
Now, it's obvious that you're a very logical and analytical person, and you have to be in order to do that job well from the bench. But you've also got this creative side to you, which leads to you being an author. I also understand that you've traveled to 65 foreign countries, including 10 communist countries. Is that
I
true?
have. I
Wow.
have. And
Wow.
most recently, we were just got back from Ireland a few weeks ago. It's about my third time over there. But in July of 2019, we were over in Fujian province in China teaching English to young high school kids over there. And that was a tremendous experience.
Wow.
How did you end up doing that?
We were then living in Louisville, and there was an Asian Cultural Alliance program headquartered there, and they had this annual program where they would select 5 or 6 individuals, and you had to apply for it, and we both got selected. So we were over there for about 30 days and taught 5 classes a day, and it was a tremendous experience, very satisfying.
Can you speak any Chinese or?
Yeah, ni hao. I'm afraid they knew a lot more English than I did Chinese. But then these were kids who had already had obviously some training in English, and the idea was that we would engage in conversational English so they could expand, their own ability, to speak the language. So I learned a little Chinese, but I don't want to go into that. So don't ask.
We're trying to send our producer to China. Maybe you can help us with.
That's an interesting experience because a lot of times you see somebody with a complete and full career and they're retired. You're not thinking they're going over to China to teach, right? That's really not. Right. That's not a story I hear every day.
Yeah.
Well, it was just an opportunity that came along, and my wife and I have traveled extensively, and so it had great appeal to us. And we had been in China about 8 years previous, and I was amazed at the change that we noticed within China, how much more prosperous it had become since we had been there previously. But just to be able to deal with these young kids, they were all in like the 9th grade, and they're so studious and so motivated that it was quite satisfying to feel like you were helping them advance in their own lives.
Now, I understand you also traveled to Cuba, and this was featured in Cigar Aficionado magazine. Is that true?
Yeah, we were in Cuba, that was a few years ago, and I was so taken with the culture and the music and the people that I wrote a long letter on my observations of being in Havana to cigar aficionado. I smoke a good Cuban now and then, and so they always had a few letters in their magazine dealing with maybe Cuba or certainly the cigar aspect. So I wrote this letter on the art and culture and the music, and they published it for 2 months in a row. And so that was fun. I just had some observations that I thought people might enjoy, and it was a real eye-opening experience. And I've learned quite a bit going to these different communist countries.
What would you say that you learned? Are there anything that sticks out in your mind as far as what you learned going to these countries?
Yes. One thing in particular, they've all embraced capitalism, but Cuba, for instance, hasn't embraced free enterprise. So if they build a new hotel in Havana, all the profits go to the government. Whereas China, and we were told this on many occasions, you're free to be an entrepreneur and you're free to get wealthy. And so that was a big distinction, because as we all know, capitalism raises all boats, as they say. But in Cuba, it's more. There's not nearly as much free enterprise there, so the people don't get the benefit of their endeavors. Where in China, it's amazing what they're doing over there.
In Cuba, is it true that you get people riding around in old cars all over the place?
Oh yeah, and as a classic car buff, it's a car geek's nirvana to see these old '56 Chevy Bel Airs riding around, and they're all very well maintained, and it's just a throwback, and that's virtually what it is. It's been unchanged since the late '50s and '60s, by and large.
What was the coolest car you saw?
I'm sorry?
What was the coolest car that you saw while you were there?
Oh, I don't recall right now.
Okay.
Probably you didn't see many Corvettes down there. They were usually, and they weren't like pristine. They were just old cars that were kept running. But they had their wear and tear. But you'd see a Oldsmobile, 58 Oldsmobile, and it was just neat to see that many cars and how they're everywhere. And contrary to that, you don't see a lot of newer aged vehicles. So.
Now, I know you said that you'll have a Cuban cigar every once in a while. I hope that while you were down there, it was more than every once in a while.
every few hours.
Every few hours. Did you get spoiled coming back to the United States and being stuck with the cigars that we've got available here?
Well, I actually outfoxed the system. I
Is the statute of limitations run? Do we have to worry about this?
I better be careful.
You need to talk to a lawyer first.
There was a cigar dealer, I believe, over in Sweden, who I won't mention the name, but you could order Cuban cigars, through them.
Oh,
wow!
So that's what I did, and then I know that the policy has changed somewhat. I think there was a period of time where you could order cigars from Cuba. I don't know if that's still the case or not. But I got mine from this outside source and was perfectly happy.
That's great. Now, looking at you writing this letter that gets published in Cigar Aficionado, and obviously the books that you've written, as an attorney and as a judge, there's a lot of writing that's involved, but it's a different kind of writing. Could you explain what you feel the difference is between your writing as an attorney and as a judge versus this kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Matter of fact, when I give presentations, I've made 40 or 50 presentations on my books to various forums, and inevitably I talk about the transition from being a federal judge to being an author. And as an attorney, yourself, Mike, you realize that when a court issues a written decision, and that's what we did in the big regulatory agencies like the FTC, the SEC, and all that, the judge is the sole trier of fact. These aren't jury trials like in the district court system. So we're issuing written decisions, and especially in the antitrust arena, an antitrust suit implicates entire industries. So everybody that's involved in that industry is anxiously awaiting whatever the decision is that's being litigated. So virtually every sentence that you write is under tremendous scrutiny. And I had the great fortune of presiding over the largest case in FTC history in 2003. And the decision, we had 74 attorneys on that case, and the decision was approximately 350 pages. And I have no doubt that every word I wrote received its fair share of criticism. And then you've got not only the parties engaged, but you've got the law journals, the trade journals, and even like in the law schools who teach antitrust law. It's not often that a major antitrust decision is handed down. So they might write a whole new chapter in their textbook just based on that case.
Wow.
So your audience is wide. And then you've got the media, our friend in the media. And during the course of this 5-month hearing, there were several conversations on CNN and MSNBC about the impact of this case on what was then the DRAM industry. So your decisions are very well scrutinized. So then, being an author, especially of fiction, it's very liberating to be able to write whatever you want without being worried about what someone thinks about how you wrote something. So.
Yeah, that is amazing. I didn't think we were gonna get into antitrust law 2 weeks in a row in this we had somebody running for Congress on the program last week, and we started getting into antitrust law. I was somewhat of an antitrust nerd in law school. My law review article was about an analysis of the Ultimate Fighting Championship under Section 2 of the Sherman Act. And shortly after I graduated, there's a lawsuit that was brought forward, and it seems like it's finally getting to the meat of the litigation all these years later, believe it or not. But did you find that a lot of this litigation was slow moving? You get 75 attorneys.
It can be. Well, like I say, when you when you're involved in an antitrust suit, it implicates companies throughout the industry. We had CEOs flying in from all over the world to testify in our case, and they can be slow moving. It was probably before the government issued their complaint in the matter. They obviously had their Bureau of Competition investigate the circumstances surrounding the alleged anti-competitive activity, and that took quite a while. And then the actual hearing, as I said, took 5 months. It took another 6 months before we issued the decision. And then there was an administrative appeal before the full FTC commission. Of course, I wrote this decision for the U.S. Court of Appeals because I knew that's where it was ultimately going. And so it took another 1.5 years probably before the U.S. Court of Appeals, who had reversed the commission's decision, which had reversed my decision, which I knew they would. So then the Court of Appeals reversed the full commission decision and reinstated my decision. And then the FTC filed an appeal from that to the Supreme Court, who declined to hear the case. So ultimately, my opinion was upheld. So that was a several-year endeavor at a cost of millions of dollars to the parties. But that's the process, unfortunately, with some of these large cases.
You said you knew that your decision would be reversed?
Yes.
How does that feel, making that decision, writing that opinion, knowing that that's going to happen? Is it a principled stand?
Well, I knew the politics of the situation. The FTC has, if you get 4 or 5 presidential appointees. So that's probably all I need to say about that. And so, especially when my initial decision dismissed the FTC's complaint in favor of the respondent company. So I knew what the FTC was going to do with that. And but that was okay because I knew in any event it was going to go to the U.S. Court of Appeals because of the money involved. And it did, and that's the audience that I wrote to. As you know, in a lower court hierarchy, if the judge's decision is based on a substantial evidence, the appellate forum is bound by law to uphold it,
Right.
regardless of their own personal take on it. And that's what they did. And I had lots of substantial evidence. So I was very confident in the outcome, and it played out as I anticipated.
I have one more sort of philosophical question for you, just because I really enjoy this stuff and I'm a little bit of a nerd. And then we'll get into talking about the books. But I have heard people, when they talk about the Sherman Act, take it from two different perspectives from a philosophical sense. I've had some people say, well, the Sherman Act is conservative in nature because it promotes competition. May the best man win. And then I've had other people say that the Sherman Act is not conservative because the true conservative path would be government stays out and doesn't get involved in sort of limiting what these companies can do. Do you have any thoughts on that whatsoever?
Well, only from a historical perspective. The FTC was founded over 100 years ago to prevent what were then called the big trusts or the corporations from dominating the marketplace. And so I'm more of a independent person who thinks the government should not be involved in every issue that confronts society. I wouldn't say I'm a libertarian, but I lean in that direction from an ideal perspective, though I realize, practically speaking, that's not going to be the case. But the FTC was founded with the idea of restraining the big trusts from having such market power that the people no longer have an effective choice in choosing services or markets. So I believe that's a valid pursuit, that the government has a right to, I always say in society, you've got to have some stop signs, or else we're all going to come to a four-way intersection and collide. So I think that's a valid use of government authority when market power becomes so controlled by one entity or even a couple of entities that the consumers and the citizenry do not have the kind of choices that they would have in a more of a free enterprise situation.
That's fascinating stuff. For those of us just tuning in, you're listening to Mike G in the Morning with The Law Matters, only on the Freedom Station, WFYL. Now, Steve, you go from your position on the bench to ultimately becoming an author. That's why we're here today, although I could probably interview you on your career as a judge and as an attorney for 2 hours. But we're here to talk about the books that you've authored. As I understand, you have 2, you have a third that's on the way. What was the inspiration to go in this direction and start to write these books, become an author?
Well, it's kind of interesting, at least to me. I always tell the story that I had a really outstanding high school English teacher. And I think she instilled in me such a solid foundation in English grammar that I used it to communicate. I found that I could write better than I could speak. And so that served me throughout my educational career and my legal career. And I never set out to be an author per se, but as I got a little bit into my career and thinking about what I enjoyed, I kind of got the itch to write something. And if you have just a second, I'll tell you a little anecdote. My wife and I, several years ago, were down in Key West at Sloppy Joe's restaurant, which was Hemingway's big hangout. And we were sitting at a table with a big portrait or a big photograph of Ernest Hemingway. So I was staring right at it, and he was staring right at me. So we stared at each other for several long moments. And at that moment, I knew that he was giving me his approval to be a writer.
Wow.
So,
Very nice.
with that inspiration, I wrote my first novel, which was called Prior Restraint, which, as you know, Mike, is a legal term.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about terrorism and the media, and begins when the nation's leading TV news anchor is brutally murdered in Washington, D.C., seemingly by foreign extremists. So, as you can imagine, that put the media establishment into a panic. But before they can make any sense of it, a few days later in Manhattan, one of the nation's leading columnists and her editor are also murdered, again, seemingly by foreign terrorists. So overnight, there was a wave of self censorship in the media itself, because everyone was afraid that anything they broadcast or published might make them a target. So behind the scenes, I had a corrupt U.S. senator who chaired the Senate Homeland Security Committee, who was investigating these murders, used the chaos to advance his own corrupt agenda. And the protagonist of the story is a young female reporter in Washington who's charged with investigating these crimes. And she soon starts to see things that no one else sees. And as she gets closer to the truth as to what happened, then her own life is put in grave danger. And even though I wrote this book several years ago, I think it's gained traction because of what many people see today as an infringement on the freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And what it speaks to as well is the fear, greed, and power that emanate in our present day media. And it's sort of it blurs the edge between the fiction of the story and the reality of our current day experience. So that's how that book came to be.
That's what I was going to ask you. Aside from the aspect of I'm going to do Hemingway well and become an author and put together this work of art, so to speak, was there anything that motivated you morally or sort of pushed you to bring some sense of awareness to the general public and the people who would read this book?
That's a great question. I don't think there was anything conscious on those lines, but there must have been some subconscious notion of, given my time and experience in Washington, and all three of my books have the underlying theme of how power is exercised in Washington. And I think that's the thing that I'm trying to bring to the public's attention. And if you've ever watched the TV show with Kevin Spacey called House of Cards,
Sure,
about Washington, it has that jaded connotation. And that's how my books are, because I take the reader behind the scenes with conversations with the politicians and the lobbyists and the trade associations. And I open the door a bit, and they see how power is really exercised, and it's not pretty. And so I think that must have been a desire of mine to write something that expresses those observations that I had made over the years.
So the reader gets to see how the sausage is made, so to speak.
That's-
So am I understanding correctly that although this is a fictional story and these are not conversations that actually took place, a lot of the things that you see very well could have taken place? It's not out of the realm of possibility. That's
It's so interesting you say that. I've had more than one person asked me during some of these presentations I made, she said, "Is that story true?" And I say, "No, but it could be."
Could be.
So I write it in a way that's so realistic, and I make the characters so understandable. I took about 4 of my main characters in prior restraints back into their childhood. So you understood not only who they were, but why they were, the way they were. And so I make it so compelling of a storyline for the reader that it has the feel of being reality.
I love that. I love that. And I know you mentioned House of Cards. Is there any other, show, movie, or book that you feel has its influence on you, and you can get that sort of sense when you read the book?
Well, there's one in particular, and it's the Manchurian Candidate, which you're probably well aware of, written back in the late 50s by I think Richard Condon, and that is a rather chilling expose on a plot to assassinate the president of the United States by a communist power. And I think that chilling nature, the stark reality of what that book portrayed, touches on the mainstream of the impact that I try to get across. These are not necessarily feel-good stories. These are reality, and in an increasingly unregulated government, it's becoming more and more of a truism. And I think people say, well, how did things get so bad in Washington? And I think the major factor is that the public is not informed as to what's going on. And for instance, I cite in a recent survey by the Annenberg Public Policy Center that says only 1 American in 4 can name the 3 branches of government. So when you have a public that is that ill-informed, not only as to how a bill becomes law, but not only understands their constitutional rights, but their constitutional obligations as citizens. So when all of that is missing from the scene, is it any wonder that the politicians are almost completely unregulated?
That's true, but you do get a sense that more of the public is being awakened to the corrupt nature of politicians and sick and tired of politics as usual. You mentioned the corrupt senator. Do you think that a decent percentage of the public has that sort of perception, or do you think that most people say, "Oh no, that could never happen. They're all buttoned up, and everything they tell us is true"?
Well, I don't think anyone thinks that. I mean, no, and I think people get their observations as well from their local governments, how contracts are let for a park or something. And I think most people have a rather realistic view of how politics, and most importantly, power, is exercised. And unfortunately, I don't think it's a pretty thing to behold, and it is somewhat cynical. But I like to say you can be more optimistic than that if you choose, but your optimism isn't going to change the objective facts regarding the circumstances we're talking about. And I think if you've been exposed to it long enough, you appreciate the reality. And like I say, it's not always pretty.
With your real world experience, Steve, in Washington, where do you think we're headed?
Well, I make a big effort not to be partisan in any aspect of my public conversations or my books. I never talk about which side of the aisle these characters are on.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said earlier, as people become less and less informed
Mm-hmm.
about the issues affecting their lives, I think we can only expect a decline
Mm-hmm.
in the ability to live as free citizens.
Mm. Interesting. Thank you.
I did kind of like that about House of Cards, that you were saying that you don't label them and tell which party they're from, because once you do that, half the people are tuning out. They say, "Oh, they're just making fun of the Republicans," or "Oh, they're just saying all the Democrats are bad." We're House of Cards, and it seems like your books as well. They're all bad. They're all bad. There's not a good side and a bad side in the grand scheme of things.
Well, that's right. And more importantly, I don't need to be partisan. I always tell my audiences that you've heard the term the art of politics. And to me, the art of politics are the politicians going to their home and districts and convincing their constituents that they're working on their behalf, when in reality, most of them are working on behalf of their corporate and sponsors. And many of these large industries are making political donations to both sides of the aisle. So it's not a partisan issue. This is the way power is exercised. And the more of the corporate money that flows into the process, the more partisan the politicians become, because they owe their allegiance to their corporate sponsors.
So do you think that getting the word out about the greed and power in Washington is something that motivates you to continue doing this?
Well, I that was never, per se my goal. I just I guess it came down to writing about that which I knew the most about, which happens to be there. I might someday write a novel totally unrelated, but so far all three of my books have taken place in Washington, and they go into the exercise of power. I don't know. I don't know what. I have an idea for my fourth book that is again going to involve how power is exercised and what. So I guess that's what I'm slated to do.
We've broken ground here, Steve. We got to the root of everything. Now you talked about writing about what you know. Do you consider yourself an insider in Washington?
Yeah, I had an inside perspective.
And so everything behind the scenes, got to peel back that curtain and everything. The title Prior Restraint, I hear that and I think of, the cases of the Pentagon Papers and Bartnicki versus Vopper. So, in the legal principle and the First Amendment sense, why did you name this Prior Restraint? Well, it doesn't sound like you're dealing with that in particular.
Well, here's why. Because the full definition of the term prior restraint is not just a government imposition on what gets published or broadcast, perhaps for legitimate national security reasons, but it's the chilling effect that such an censorship has on the individual or the individual company. And then more importantly, that chilling effect emanates from a latent fear that if I say or publish the wrong things, I could be punished by an individual or a group. And then ultimately, the third component of that definition is the self-censorship that comes from that fear. And that was the essence of what this book was about.
Absolutely. And I don't think it's gotten even a drop less relevant today. If nothing else, is more relevant today than ever. As an insider, I do have to ask you this. We often hear about the chief of staff. And to what extent in your experience, does the chief of staff drive what a politician does?
Chief of staff is an integral part of the politician's daily, not only the schedule, but he or she decides who gets in to see the politician, what lobbyists, what trade associations, what constituents perhaps, and they become, I think, the politician's most trusted aide. And keep in mind, these politicians are pulled in 100 different directions, and they need someone to kind of organize the chaos. And so I've always felt that a chief of staff was the alter ego. And in my book, Prior Restraint, the chief of staff was very powerful in his own right and became known as a de facto congressman himself. He yielded power of his own because of his close association with his employer.
You talked about how you really went to great lengths to develop these characters. You get to know them and the why. How did you do that, though? How did you come up with these characters and develop them?
That's another really good question. To me, that is the most satisfying part of being an author. Is I saw an interview with James Patterson one time, and he says he doesn't start on a new book until he knows how it's going to end. I'm not like that. I may have a general idea regarding the story, but I like to think that when I create my first 4 or 5 major characters in the story, that they carry the storyline. It's like I'm in the room with them, observing and listening to them and hearing how they're going to react to whatever the circumstances is. So I spend a lot of effort creating characters that are so real that you can't help but follow their lead. And in my second book called Fractured Power, I had a murder trial with a alleged serial killer in East Tennessee. And one of the key characters was this gentleman from up in the hills of East Tennessee. And I did quite a bit of work researching what would be an appropriate name for this gentleman. And I looked at the most common surnames in East Tennessee. So I named him Otis Stamper. Doesn't that sound like someone from East Tennessee? And being from Kentucky, that's not meant as a slight in any way, shape, or form. But I try to give characters a regional trait. And if another character comes from Arizona, I imbue them with traits that might come from someone who grew up in the Southwest. And the same thing, I try to make the characters so real. And once they're established in the story, as I say, I like to think that they carry it. And I think that's what keeps the reader turning the pages.
Now, this does seem to be something that comes quite naturally to you, and you're obviously very good at it because you're on a roll here, coming up with yet another book. But what do you think is the most challenging aspect for you as a writer?
That's a good question again. For me,
killing it.
More than Chris, does he always have this? Or this many good questions?
He's generally pretty good, but he's really on today.
But not always. Right?
Right. I don't have to jump in much today.
Yeah, but to me, the hardest part of coming up with a new book is creating a unique storyline. And again, I'll cite James Patterson, who's obviously been a tremendous, success and a great writer, but he's written like 27, 28 novels. But I always say if you've read 2 or 3 of them, you've probably read them all because they tend to be rather formulistic, and that's fine. But I like to make my storylines unique. And my second book, Fractured Power, has a storyline that I don't think's ever been done before. So it takes me weeks once I'm in the mode to come up with a new book to contemplate, well, what do I want to write about? What's going to be the story? So that's the most difficult aspect. And then once I get the storyline, I'll start to outline it, just a rough outline as to where I think it's going to go. And then I create my characters. And after that, I'll do research on, on whatever the situation. An interesting sidelight. I was playing golf out in Scottsdale, Arizona, 4 or 5 years ago, and we had a gentleman join us from a little town in Bisbee, Arizona, which I had never heard of, but I became infatuated with Bisbee, Arizona. And when I had some free time, I did some homework on it. And it's a little town just north of the border in the southern part of Arizona. And I used Bisbee as the opening scene of my next book.
Oh, cool.
So you pick up these things that have an attraction to you. And then I try to research as much as I can the storylines behind an industry. Or I have a great scene in Prior Restraint where there's a private jet sabotage and it crashes. And I did a lot of research on pilot to air command center controls and the conversation and the drama that would come from that kind of a scene. So I just try to make it as real as I can. I think I do a pretty good job.
What's your process, Steve, for writing? Do you write in a certain location? Do you use a typewriter, a computer? Like, do you write it down, or what's your creative process? If you
I write, like I said, I use my the desktop computer, and I write on Word, and I'll do, like I say, an initial outline, and then I just try to do it one chapter at a time, and constantly thinking about how that's going to lead into the next chapter. And I sometimes give little hints as to where it's going. Like at the very end of the chapter, I might write one little sentence that might be an internal thought of one of the characters, and you don't pick up on it. But if you were to go back and read all those hints, you would see I was telling the reader what's going on the whole time. So it's just a little sidelight. And, the readers can always go on my website, StephenMcGuireAuthor.com, and they can learn about me and my books and as to where they can purchase them. And so I oftentimes talk as well about the publishing industry, how it's evolving.
Yeah, I was going to ask that because, this is self-published from what I understand. I would think that you'd have a lot of publishers who wouldn't want to touch this thing because there's just too many dark secrets revealed. Is that true?
Well, I think publishers will publish whatever they think's going to sell. And it always amazes me when you go to the airport or something and go into the little bookstore and you'll show the New York Times best-selling books, and inevitably you'll see a book there by Tom Clancy. Now, Tom Clancy's been dead for 10 years, so he's not writing any new books, but somebody is writing, obviously with the approval of his estate, to use his name on his book, I guess, to sell the idea that I write like Tom Clancy writes. But just that name, Tom Clancy, is going to sell the book.
Right.
So I think the traditional publishers are looking for either someone who's already in the public domain, who people are going to recognize, or something that they think is going to sell. I think the beauty of self-publishing, which I'm published on Amazon, is that you can get published. There, by the way, are 33 million book titles on Amazon.
Wow.
which is a staggering number.
Mm.
But they will
30
help you
flavors.
design your cover, give you an ISBN number, format the book, and so it gives an author an opportunity to get established. Now, the hard part after that is to market your book. But what most people don't realize is that outside of your major authors, there's not a lot of money to be made in publishing, being an author. I read one survey by a esteemed publishing company. It said 70% of all published works do not turn a profit. So most people, including myself, do it for the joy of writing and getting the ability to meet interesting people, such as yourself. And,
Present company excluded.
well, I didn't say how, in what way, but so my wife, who was a former special agent in Washington, she's serving as my marketing agent. She's done a great job putting together these radio interviews and the presentations. I've done about 3 radio interviews in the last 10 days. And so it's fun. I get out and I get to talk to people, and it's enjoyable.
We'll have to have her on next.
Yeah, right.
I do want to ask you, what's the next book? Can you tell us any of the?
I can. It's coming out here hopefully in the next 30 days. It's going to be called Secret and Deceit. And it's a pulsating thriller, I believe, about a coup to assassinate the president, who has an aggressive legislative agenda with broad popular support, which is going to impact the corporate profits of a greedy industry by billions of dollars. So they try to do everything they can to prevent this legislation from even getting up for a vote. But when they have a corrupt U.S. senator who's handling and stifling this legislation in the Senate, and he tells them he can't hold it off any longer, they make the decision to assassinate the president because they can't afford this unfettered imposition on their billions of dollars that are at stake. So again, the protagonist is a Secret Service agent who's on the president's protective detail. And after the president is in fact assassinated, he conducts his own investigation into how this could happen when he discerns that the official investigation doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So
does that ever really happen where the official investigation isn't what they're telling the people?
Now you want to be a writer. So it takes the reader on this international tour of the cabal behind this conspiracy to kill the president. And like my reporter in my first book, Agent Russo in this book puts his own life in tremendous jeopardy as he gets closer to finding out who really killed the president. And so it's something that I think is pretty topical with these big industries these days. So.
Yeah, definitely.
An Italian guy who's going to save the day. Count me in, Steve.
Well, he's from Bensonhurst, New York. So
yeah, I'm from Brooklyn. That's it.
Yeah, Brooklyn.
There you go.
Bensonhurst. That's funny. I can't wait to read that. I'm going to buy a copy for everybody in my family.
Oh, good. So hopefully that one's going to be coming out in about 30 days, and it'll be on Amazon. It's called Secret Deceit.
I do have one more substantive question for you. With all of your themes and everything like that, particularly with prior restraint, what do you think about the state of free speech in this country today?
It's so interesting you say that. I just saw something today online where some politician out in Arizona, don't ask me who, because I didn't read the whole article, made a comment that free speech is very dangerous. And I just was just taken back by that. And it seems to be that that's the burgeoning narrative that seems to be, becoming more and more commonplace. You're reading where colleges and universities are sanctioning their own faculty for talking in ways that maybe are controversial from their perspective.
Jordan Peterson is a good example.
And nothing could be further from the mission of a university to expose young people to a universe of thought so they can decide what's is the best way to proceed. So I'm concerned about the suppression of free speech, and I believe it's becoming more of an issue.
Man, it's a heavy topic right there in and of itself.
It's kind of dangerous for you to say that, I think.
Yeah. We've been censored on different platforms multiple times, unfortunately. Do you think that reporters are afraid to go out there and speak the truth?
I think reporters are paid to report on subjects and in perspectives that their employers want them to report on.
So it's not even necessarily a fear thing. It's that they've got an agenda.
Well, I'm not saying it's a fear thing, but yeah, I think most people, most of them, maybe not so much on the local media, but in the mainstream, their employers have an expectation of what they want their reporting to entail, and I think that's the operative mechanism.
Well, there have been things that have happened in this country in recent memory where you got this one narrative that's been pushed by the media. Maybe down the road we find out it isn't necessarily true, but that narrative is in alignment with some of the, let's say, sponsors of the networks, things of that nature.
Yeah. Well, whether it's true or not, it seems to be slanted. And I thought the objective, I'm too old-fashioned. I thought the objective was to present free and open ideas without putting a slant on it so people could decide for themselves. When a story is reported, I don't need an interpretation. Just tell me what happened and let me decide the interpretation. But you don't see that much anymore.
It's a lot of opinion out there as opposed to actual news.
That's right.
Yeah, but this program is the free and open exchange of thoughts and ideas. Steve, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. What's the website? How can people get the book? Tell them everything they need to know.
Okay. Again, my website is Stephen McGuire. That's Stephen with a P-H-E-N. StephenMcGuireAuthor.com. And you can buy my books on Amazon Books. And you can go on my website and read about myself and my two dogs, and read about my books, and that should give you all you need to know. And then go on the Amazon, the reviews of my books, and that'll give you some pretty good insight as to what other people have thought about my stories.
Absolutely. Liberty from our program just came up with a good new tagline for your line of books. It's fiction or faction.
That's good. That's good.
I like it.
It's a very fine line between illusion and reality.
That's right. We love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Steve. That's all the time we got for today. Stick around for We the People, The Constitution Matters. Pastor David Whitney, Professor Phil Duffy. We miss you, Ellie. Daddy loves you.